I plan to cover Should España be Muslim again? Was Al-Andalus paradise? How the Kaaba is satanic? Why the elite synagogue of Satan invented Islam? Mohammed said, Spaniards found in Islam what quenches their thirst. They found in Islam the peace and tranquility that they lacked from the authority of the so-called church. He's referring, of course, to the Mary worshippers who are actually heretics, not real Christians. He said, Al-Andalus was paradise, at least for science. I told him I love Arabic. I said some other stuff, and then I said, if the Europeans believed Muslim rule in Iberia was so grand, they wouldn't have fought for centuries to get rid of the oppressors. Who fights paradise? The Quran says, fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His supposed messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of so-called truth from those who were given the scripture. Fight them until they give the jizya willingly, while they are humbled, bringing them low. So it is meant to humiliate people. It is meant to oppress people. If you're brought low, that means you're oppressed by definition. So according to this Assyrian in America, who unfortunately is an atheist, I prefer Muslims to atheists. Now, to answer the question, should Spain be Muslim? My answer is, it is better than an atheistic, liberal shithole Spain. So Al-Andalus 2.0, I welcome you. Although I'm not living in Spain and I never set foot there, but my blood is from there. Now then, this Assyrian in America said, the jizya was a poll tax given by the various Muslims who applied that exclusively to the non-Muslim subjects, like Jews and nominal Christians. People of the book, I'm not sure if it did cover Zoroastrians and Hindus, because those would have been kuffars, right? Just total infidels, totally pagan people, not people of a book with some holiness, right? Anyway, so it was primarily through taxes on dhimmis, of which the jizya was one of several taxes, that the caliphates maintained their treasury. So the dhimmis did not have to serve in the army. Why? Because they couldn't be trusted. They could have sided with the enemies if the enemies had the same religion. So the tax was to compensate for their not being participants in wars, for example. But the dhimmi were forbidden from possessing dangerous weapons. They were supposed to be defenseless sheep in the pack of wolves. That is a Muslim world where they oppress you, because it's a mafia. Now, a lot of countries that are Muslim, they don't really practice Muslim law devoutly. They have a lot of liberal nonsense involved. Some of that isn't nonsense, but a lot of it is. So I'm not saying, just because a Muslim country has relative tolerance doesn't mean that Islam is tolerant. That just means they don't really practice Islam correctly. If they follow the book that says fight them until they're subdued and oppress them. Now, the jizya tax is what one might give to a mobster who runs a neighborhood so that he does not murder your family. And on the issue of jizya in India, it is said that Khaljis enslaved people for 12 years if they didn't pay the jizya. So the jizya was so severe that the equivalent was slavery for 12 years. That's how burdensome that tax was. And Hamuyan increased it apparently threefold to encourage more conversions. I think they meant to say conversions, not convictions. Why? Because if you're burdened for not being a Muslim, you'll want to take that burden off, and becoming a Muslim would be the way to do that. A Muslim propagandist said that countries conquered by the sword for Islam, Islam lost those countries, but countries that were conquered by preaching and conviction, are still Muslim countries today, he says. But that's nonsense, because it was for commercial benefits that kings, like in what is now Indonesia, became Muslims. Become a Muslim and you'll have access to more markets or less tariffs, or whatever you want to call them. Less hurdles to sell your stuff and more people to sell to, more benefits. That's why Indonesia is Muslim. For money, not for conviction. Of course, the people have to follow the king. And don't tell me that there were no massacres. That's absurd. Of course there were massacres here and there. It wasn't always peaceful. People don't give up their centuries-old traditions at the snap of a finger. There has to be resistance. But that's not what this video is about. Peter Hertz said, early Islamic practice was to keep the Ahl al-Kitab, people of the book, as a subjugated tax base from which an extra tax was collected. Hence, as long as the people kept their place, lower houses, stepping on the sidewalk, riding nothing bigger than donkey, and dismounting at the approach of Muslim, wearing distinctive garb, refraining from keeping arms, staying in their own ghettos, accepting the abduction of their beautiful daughters, they could live as they pleased under the supervision of their cucked leaders. I said, great comment. The satanic cube worshippers hate you because you expose their mafia. Later on I'll prove that that cube is satanic. God willing, inshallah. Not that your Allah is the same as my God. They're very different. In a lot of ways similar, but in a lot of ways different. So a Muslim said, mostly false. Many of these dhimis were in the government. Yeah, but they never had the top spot, and they were always the minority. Later he says that Muslims paid the same amount of tax, but it was zakat, which is the obligatory tax for the poor that Muslims have to pay. Which, if you're richer than other people, I think you have to pay more. Also depends on the kingdom. So he says they were equal. It depends. In some places, yes. In some places, certainly not. So he calls this Islamophobia. I told him, truth phobes, calling him an Islamophobe means you don't know what a phobia is. A phobia is, by definition, irrational. What he said was the truth and cannot be irrational. At least as far as the jizya being oppressive. Again, Iberia. The Europeans wanted to take off and break the Muslim yoke, and they fought for centuries, and they shed blood for centuries to do so. Why? Because it wasn't paradise. Because it was oppression. That's why. It was a burden as punishment for not being a follower of the false prophet Mohammed, who is currently in hell because he deceived people. Millions of people, billions, are deceived because of that man who served the synagogue of Satan, as this series, God willing, will prove. Mark Bryan says, so Islam works like a mafia with a protection racket. He said the Ottomans would apply jizya differently in different regions, and the Eastern European Mary-worshipping heretic slave boys taken to become elite janissaries were a form of jizya. So that's how severe the tax was, that an equivalent could have been slavery. So what is the value of a slave? That's how oppressive jizya is. Now, the Spanish hated Islam so much that when they went to America, they didn't find Muslims. Some Muslims say that there were Muslims because Columbus or someone like him described in an island of the Caribbean houses or buildings resembling mosques. But the key word here is resembling. That doesn't prove that there were mosques. Don't jump to conclusions. The Spanish hated Islam so much that when they went to America, they named the place Matamoros, which is in Mexico. And Matamoros means Moor slayer or kill Moors. The Spanish weren't really, some were, of course, because you always have racists in every kingdom. Or almost every kingdom. But, hating the Moors wasn't because of their race. It was their religion. Why? Because they were the oppressors. The same way that Russians hated the Nazis, because the Nazis were oppressors when they invaded Slavic lands and raped the woman and so forth. So the Spanish Empire, which by the way, as I proved in my series on the British Empire not being the biggest, hypocrites count oceans of sand but not oceans. In that series, I proved that the Spanish Empire and other Europeans were controlled by the synagogue of Satan. It's not just Islam that was controlled by the Jews, and still is, in every country. Now, Juan Antonio Alonso said, there weren't a million Spanish Muslims. Don't be stupid. In Spain, there is religious freedom to an extent, and therefore anyone can choose the religion they want, something that does not exist in Muslim countries. Unless they're so liberal, they're not really Muslim. I can't think of one right now. Of course, there are people who are converts to Islam, which they have a right to, apparently, and they have the freedom to practice their religion. But of course, there aren't a ton of Spaniards who converted to Islam. In Muslim countries, there is no flourishing of other religions because there is no freedom of religion. Muslims cannot abandon Islam, or they have crosshairs on their back. They don't even think about it in their mental scheme, which is terrible, in my opinion. I'm like, yeah, you're right. The Mohammedan, Iqbal Muhammad, wants to hide the truth. Islam is oppressive. Al-Andalus was no paradise, except for the rich of the correct religion, correct relative to the leadership at the time. So Iqbal Muhammad said, judging by the caliber of your mentality, I shudder to think of the mentality, or lack of it, of the people who are upvoting your stupid comment. It just goes to show what some people are here for, doesn't it? Well, Islam is bad, so it's not wrong to hate it. So the Muslim, instead of using reason, says, you're stupid. He just spits on him because this guy says the truth, which is Muslims aren't allowed to abandon Islam.
What is the penalty for leaving the Muslim faith?
To be honest, I cannot back that point up.
Well, if it's an Islamic country, then the Sharia is very clear. Apostasy is dealt with the death penalty.
Thank you. That's all I want to hear.
But what's the relevance between what happens in an Islamic country and Great Britain? I fail to see the connection.
Okay.
The connection, of course, is that Muslims in Europe want their government system called Islam to take over everything, and that will mean no freedom for anyone to reject Islam, because then they'll kill you, murder you. That's the connection. Now, I must say that although Richard Dawkins has a point against Islam because it's a false religion, that doesn't make his atheism right, of course. What is the penalty for questioning atheism in North Korea, where they do not call their leader a literal god? Death, of course, or imprisonment to get raped by the soldiers or whoever. So Dawkins is a hypocrite who turns a blind eye to atheist equivalents of that. Whoever disbelieves in Allah after his belief, except for one who is forced while his heart is secure in faith, but those who open their breasts to disbelief, upon them is wrath from Allah, and for them is a great punishment. So this says that you can reject Islam with your mouth, but secretly still be a Muslim. In other words, you can lie about abandoning Islam. According to the Quran, you should lie, says the Quran. The Quran says you should lie as a Muslim if it suits you. You should lie as a Muslim to advance Islam. So Islam is very anti-truth. Islam is truth-phobic. So people who say Islamophobia, that doesn't mean anything. It's not irrational to oppose tyranny and lies. What's irrational is to say you should lie to advance our movement. By the way, our movement is the truth. Yeah, sure. Let not the believers take disbelievers for their friends in preference to believers. Whoso doeth that hath no connection with Allah, unless that ye but guard yourselves against them, taking security. Allah biddeth you beware of himself. Unto Allah is the journey. So it says taking security. So you should pretend to be friends. You should lie about your relationships with non-Muslims and pretend that you're their friend when you actually want to destroy their civilization as a Muslim. Part 2 next, God willing.